Colin Chapman was Lotus. Colin Chapman founded Lotus. Colin Chapman was the dynamic behind the growth and the enormous success of Lotus. He was a first-rate engineer. I think he'll go down in history as great an engineer as Brunel. Some will argue it's a shame that he got involved with motor cars, because the Concorde would have been a better aircraft if he'd been on the design team. Well, he first got into motor cars trying to supplement his inadequate college grant by buying and selling used cars. Then he decided that he would try racing one, and he did rather well in it because he was a crazy fast driver. Well, the Mark I, the Mark II and the Mark III were basically home-built cars in a garage, and then he went on. He never built a Mark V. The Mark V was always, that mark was reserved one day for a 100-mile-an-hour Austin 7 car. But then the 6 was the forerunner of the 7, and the 7 itself was where Lotus got into volume.
Driving this car is very much to put yourself at one with the road. Unlike other car manufacturers, perhaps, that try to isolate you from the road, Chapman tried to get you as close to it as possible, get as much feel back into the whole being. It's a wonderful experience. I mean, contemporary journalists at the time described it as a four-wheel motorbike, and somewhere around about half a hundredweight. Therefore, they could use a much lighter and smaller power unit, which was always Chapman's philosophy. Basically, he considered that speed really was lightness at the end of the day.
We asked the customs and excise, if you build a car from various parts, from various sources, do you have to pay purchase tax? And they said, well, no. So Colin said, well, how many sources? And they said, well, more than one. So when you bought your Lotus 7, you got 2 invoices. And you paid no tax.
Basically, the tub would arrive, less the interior and the wings, and he would put the whole thing together, put the engine in during the course of, say, a week. Instructions weren't given as such. You weren't allowed to supply instructions. Basically, what you would do is get a copy of the sports car and Lotus owner, and in there a journalist would have had one of these cars to build, and he would have described how to build it. The people that would have bought these cars would have been sports cars enthusiasts that actually wanted a hands-on build car, something that they could actually feel that they've achieved something at the end of the day. They could drive the car on the road and take it out clubman racing if they wanted to at the weekends. It's historically recorded that somewhere in the region of 25% of these home-built cars were actually raced pre-1960. I suppose one of the most famous drivers of this mark must be Graham Hill, who in 1959 went out on a very wet Boxing Day at Brands Hatch and thrashed all the much bigger, more powerful aerodynamic cars to a sensational victory. In 1973, the production rights of the 7 were given to Graham Nern, who was the Lotus sales agent for Lotus at Caterham. He's continued to manufacture the car and develop the car up until the modern day equivalent. He's actually using the K-Series engine and the Vauxhall engine in the car now. It's been very successful, and they've instigated their own race series.
It's become timeless. It's a wonderful basic car, no doors, goes like hell, makes lovely noise, and it was basically cheap, and you could win races with it on Sunday and drive it to work on Monday. Everybody from 17 to 70 wants one.
It's brilliant. I love it. I love it to drive. When you drive it, it's exciting. It raises your adrenaline. It makes you feel part of the road, part of the whole thing of driving. It's just like nothing else.
Well, with the 7 paying the rent, Chapman could now do what he wanted to do, and that was to develop new technologies, and he obviously wanted to get rid of the chassis. And the way to get rid of the chassis was to design a monocoque fiberglass, and that was quite an innovation, fiberglass body shell, put a lightweight, high-powered engine in it, put top-class Lotus suspension in it, and then build a car that was aesthetically beautiful.
This car is a 1962 Lotus Elite. It has a 1216 Coventry Climax engine, which was derived from a fire pump, and in this state of tune it delivers 95 brake horsepower, which gives it a top speed of approaching 125 miles an hour, 0 to 60 in 10 seconds, and 0 to 100 in just over 20. The car only weighs 10 3/4 hundredweight, and it was revolutionary in its day. Colin Chapman thought the way to go was to produce a Grand Tourer, if you like, a closed coupe, something that people could remain warm and dry, and he was fascinated by this new material called GRP, glass reinforced plastic. As it turned out, it was extremely complicated to do, and 57 different molds make up this particular car. There is no chassis, and only 2 pieces of steel are in this structure, hence the light weight.
And the Lotus Elite is still a most beautiful car to behold from any angle. There's not an ugly way to look at it. Where you look down on it from above, you lie down on the pavement and look at it, you photograph it from any angle. I defy you to find an ugly angle.
The car was an amazing success. You have to think back at the time when it was penned in '57, the first cars were delivered towards the end of 1958. You had the choice of an MGA or a TR3, big, heavy, ponderous cars. And here you had this amazing, delicate little vehicle that if you sneezed, you ended up in the ditch. Nobody in the motoring public or press at that time were prepared for this amazing razor-sharp steering and, of course, lightning brakes.
Lotus marketing has always been fairly simple. Right from the start, perhaps when Colin Chapman had very little money, he wouldn't want to market through advertising, taking space in magazines, producing expensive brochures. When they were more successful and perhaps had the money to market, they didn't need to. Their racing successes provided the advertising, and Chapman, I think, traditionally didn't provide materials, resources, archives. He wasn't concerned with that sort of thing. Certainly early Lotus material is very factual. It gives a simple picture, simple specifications and text. If you wanted a Lotus, you had the common sense to work out what pedigree it had got, the common sense to work out that it was fast. You weren't told anything in Lotus material, and you certainly weren't impressed by Lotus material. You were impressed by Lotus cars.
Driving an Elite today, where we're all cocooned in completely hush-hush Vauxhall Cavaliers and the like, this is mind-blowingly noisy. As it doesn't have a separate chassis, the little cabin area acts as a sound box. So you have absolutely everything coming into your ears. You have the rear suspension thumping away, you have the prop shaft 2 inches from your knee, the gearbox is 2 inches from your shins. Everything is sitting in there with you. The fuel consumption knocks the spots of virtually every car known to man today, and regularly returns over 45 to the gallon at 90 miles an hour. I first saw the Elite at the 1957 Motor Show. I was 9 years old at the time, and I thought it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my life, and I still do.
In the late 50s, the cars that Chapman was designing and building were still specifically to win races, and they were winning races. The company was getting into single-seater racing. The company was beginning to attract names like Innes Ireland and Graham Hill, both to work in the company and drive the cars. And all over the world, the name Lotus meant something. Almost every weekend, Lotus cars were winning the length and breadth of the world. At Hornsey, in 1957 onwards, they were building the Elite successfully. They were building racing cars for sale all over the world, and they were winning races. Team Lotus itself was establishing itself, knocking on the door of Formula One and winning other events. And of course the Lotus 7 was paying the rent. Against this background of success, the company was ready to move forward. And more by accident than design, a new car was beginning to take shape that would be built at the new factory at Cheshunt, and this would really put Lotus on the map. This was excitement on 4 wheels.
This car is a Lotus Elan S2, built in 1965. It was bought in that year as a kit of parts, which was a service offered by Lotus in an effort to avoid purchase tax. You could either opt for the kits or you could buy a ready assembled car. This one was assembled by the local distributor and has been in the family ever since. First ride in this car was obviously in 1965 when I was about 3.5 years old, and I can remember it vividly. It was at night. I presume it was the day that my father had just bought it, and he must have woken me up, taken me down into the car and took me up the road. I was actually sitting on the transmission tunnel, and I can remember the exhilaration and the speed. It seemed a different world to me. That has stuck in my mind ever since. The Elan rose out of the ashes, really, of the Lotus Elites. After about 1,000 Elites had been produced, Chapman went back to the drawing board, and the result was the Elan.
Chapman wanted the concept of chassis-less construction to continue into the Elan. Ron Hickman, the design and development director, wanted to test all the rolling components of the vehicle. So one night at a dinner, Chapman and Hickman designed a one-off test bed chassis it was called the fold along the dotted line chassis. They actually mocked it up on the menu card, like these things you cut out of a Kellogg's cornflake packet. But that chassis proved to be so good, so docile, gave the car such enormous handling, and proved so cheap to make, that from that day on, we at Lotus adopted the backbone chassis concept.
The Elan was the first car that Lotus produced that made any money, and it was very important, probably a milestone car in that respect. The Elite had been a sales disaster. The Elan really was an instant success. It proved reliable, comfortable. It was more refined to drive than the Elite. It was a car that was designed really for twisty A roads and B roads, and that's where it excels. It's comfortable too. That's a surprising factor, especially when you look inside the car and you see the seats, which are obviously an old-fashioned design, and they look thin and appear not to have much body to them. But I've driven the car for hours at a time, and I don't get any hint of backache at all. Driving position's good. It's the classic straight leg, straight arm position, and that's probably got a lot to do with it. It's an easy car to drive. It's an easy car to drive quite quickly. It's very forgiving. Because it holds the road so well, you often don't know how fast you're going, and that all-round drivability, I think, is what has made it so popular. It's the true classic British sports car.
By 1965-66, Lotus were in an expansion requirement in every possible area. We needed to build more factories. We couldn't get an industrial development certificate to expand in the existing location. And also we wanted a test track. We've been using the A10 for testing racing cars and road cars for years, and the residents and the police were getting a bit fed up. We were in a sort of unionised labour sandwich with Luton just up the road and Dagenham just down the road. Both make manufacturing cars, and of course our employees knew what was being paid on the production lines and the overtime, and we couldn't meet those figures. And we'd also lose labour to Dagenham and Vauxhall when they really were recruiting heavily. And the other thing was, we were dead set against any form of union in the factory. We had enough problems when our suppliers went on strike. And for Chapman, the idea that our own employees might go on strike was absolutely out of the question. He went on record as saying, if this company comes unionised, I will shut it down. Lotus styling had been done in-house with using consultants like John Frayling, but it was Colin's final decision and Colin's aesthetic eye that decided the styling and set the standard, which was always very high. The first break away from that was when Giugiaro in Italy offered to do a body design on the Europa, and that of course became the Esprit and opened up a whole new era of design for Lotus and a big move upmarket. Less cars, bigger engines, higher prices.
Lotus made the Esprit, I think, to capture the Ferrari market. They wanted basically an Italian car design, which they had in Giugiaro, and people wanted something which was a match for the Ferrari. As soon as the Esprit was produced, everybody wanted one. It was in great demand. The second Esprit, the Esprit S2, sold like hotcakes. You couldn't get them for love nor money. The reason most people buy a Lotus Esprit is because of the way it looks, the sharp angular design, the very Ferrari-like look, the Italian styling, not really for the performance. You know, the performance is an added bonus.
When we decided to turbocharge the Esprit, when Chapman said it had got to be done, he bought nearly everything with a turbocharger, including 2 aeroplanes, and they were all studied, and the car was totally re-engineered to take a turbocharger. He didn't just hang one on the engine and see how it would go. So he was always pushing ahead. Everything had to be better and better and better.
It's a very exciting car to drive, superb handling. With the HC engine, it's a very quick car. There's very little on the road that will accelerate as quickly as this. The handling is superb in wet or dry conditions. Being a mid-engine car, everything is in the right place. The fuel tanks are each side of the engine. Most of the weight is inside the wheels. That's to say that there's very little overhang each end. So it makes it a very enjoyable car to drive, very exciting car to drive. A little bit twitchy on the limit because it's mid-engined, but most owners never find the limit. The Lotus Esprit lifted Lotus onto another plane. Suddenly they lost their kit car image. The top of the range now is the Turbo Esprit Sport 300, which has bigger wings, bigger wheels and a 300 brake horsepower engine. Basically Peter Stevens came along and he rounded all the edges of the Giugiaro Esprit. The Giugiaro Esprit owners feel that was sacrilege, it ruined their car and would not give house room to a Peter Stevens car. The same can be said for Peter Stevens designed owned cars. They feel the Esprit Giugiaro is dated and looks old-fashioned.
In the cutthroat competition of the supercar or semi-supercar market, you had to produce materials that, in a pile by the armchair, could compete with the other sports car manufacturers, the TVRs or even the Jaguars, the Mercedes sports cars, so that your Lotus material became more significant.
I first saw an Esprit at the 1975 Motor Show, which was a white S1 Esprit with a gleaming Wolf Race wheels. And it looked like something from outer space. It was just absolutely amazing. Nobody had ever seen one. There was never been another car like it. And it was so futuristic. And I thought, well, I've got to own one of these, but I never ever thought I would. The very word Lotus evolves all sorts of feelings inside. The Lotus is more than just a car. It's a hobby. It's great fun to drive. For me, it's my whole life. Everything I do is all around Lotus cars.
from the mid-70s, the British motor industry was having a very bad time indeed. In fact, all luxury markets were really badly hit, and Lotus were particularly badly hit. I wouldn't say the quality of the product was particularly good, so of course you missed out on brand loyalty. Not many Lotus buyers were selling a car and buying another one. So that was a problem. Chapman was not doing well in Grand Prix racing, and as that was his number one love, it's possible that too much time was being devoted to trying to recover the reputation of the racing team. And the company put out one or two bad balance sheets at that time. Being a public company by then, of course, that was very important. The company had problems with financing. Lotus did have financing problems. Chapman's brilliantly innovative twin chassis Grand Prix car was banned by the FIA. The DeLorean business had gone sour. Chapman was under colossal stress, and he came home in December 1982 from a sad meeting in Paris and died.
Lotus founder Colin Chapman took the format beyond the bounds of even the most imaginative designer. Chapman, quite simply, was one of the great geniuses of motorsport who would take his theories to the limit and constantly sought solutions to the most imaginative ideas which would mark 2 decades of motorsport. Chapman's Lotus 18 was a sort of refined Cooper, still with a multitubular chassis, but its successor, the 25, was the first monocoque chassis in Formula One, a chassis made of stressed, shaped aluminium moulded around bulkheads, and while not an original Chapman idea, is still the basis of Formula One chassis today. The great Jimmy Clark never drove for another team but Lotus in Formula One. He won 19 races, and his 2 world championships came driving first of all the neat Lotus 25 and then its successor, the 33, the 2 most advanced cars in the early 60s. His driving was almost insolent in its apparent ease. Colin Chapman was entrusted with the first Ford Cosworth DFV V8 engine in 1967, and he designed the Lotus 49 around it, using the engine as a stressed member, again a first in Formula One.
See if it's a motor car.
I hope so.
So do I. Yeah, that's fitting well. Beautiful. Yep, that's the job. Lovely.
The chassis itself had a strange look. It finished right behind the driver's back, and the rear suspension was part of the engine and gearbox assembly, which was designed to take it. It was also a weight-saving solution, which Graham Hill put to good use by winning the 1968 World Championship. Jim Clark took the Lotus 49 and its Cosworth engine to a remarkable debut victory at the Dutch Grand Prix in 1967, and the car and its derivatives would go on to win 12 Grand Prix in 3 seasons, in the hands of Clark, Graham Hill and Jochen Rindt. But more than that, it was the inspiration for other constructors in Formula One, rather as the Lotus 25 had been in building their cars for the new 3-litre formula introduced in 1966. Chapman's message soon made its mark. But now Chapman and his fellow constructors began a trip up a dangerous blind alley as they developed bigger, higher and more fragile wings, which, when they failed, caused horrific accidents. The governing body had to put a stop to it, and quickly. But the basic idea was an extension of the use of cars' aerodynamics. No longer was it simply important that it cut through the air with ease, but that it was pushed down onto the ground to give it better grip. Chapman was the first to realise this with his designer Maurice Philippe and their joint production, the Lotus 72. It was in a Lotus 72 that Jochen Rindt died in practice for the 1970 Italian Grand Prix. But he would become posthumous world champion that year. Then it was Emerson Fittipaldi's turn to profit from the extraordinary potential of this innovative and revolutionary machine. Its shape not only produced a remarkable amount of downforce, but moving the radiators from the front of the car to the side pods made a significant change to weight distribution to the rear, which in turn improved traction and grip. Once again, this inspired concept from the fertile brain of Colin Chapman would be adopted by all his rivals. But the 72 was so advanced that it enjoyed an exceptionally long career, seeing service over 4 seasons. It was obviously a distinguished career as well, for this car would win more races than any other in the World Championship, winning 17 Grand Prix in the hands of Rindt, Fittipaldi and Ronnie Peterson. It became the JPS Special for a while, adopting the name of its sponsor, but the Lotus 72 helped Fittipaldi to the first of his 2 World Championships in 1972. Chapman's last technical gift to Formula One before dying of a heart attack at the start of the 80s was the idea of using ground effect in Formula One. This comprised creating a depression beneath the car which would literally be sucked down onto the road. It was first seen on the Lotus 78, which appeared at the start of the 1977 season, but it suffered a lack of reliability. However, once again, Chapman and his associates Tony Rudd and Peter Wright had succeeded in eclipsing their rivals. Chapman had basically gained on 2 fronts. Downforce was no longer obtained by the wings. These were simply used to balance the car, so there was less drag. In order to produce the lack of pressure under the car, the side pod's undersides were shaped in order to accelerate airflow from the front to the rear of the car, and the extremes of the side pods were fitted with sliding skirts to make the sides airtight. The grip that this produced gave phenomenal road holding, and with it, Mario Andretti and Ronnie Peterson completely dominated the 1978 season. By winning 6 Grand Prix, the American took the World Championship ahead of his Swedish teammate, who would be tragically killed in the Italian Grand Prix, a race that was becoming the team's black spot after Rindt's accident in 1970 and being blamed for Von Trips's in 1961. Once again, Chapman had caught his rivals unawares. But once again, however, less innovative but more painstaking rivals would catch him and overtake. After Chapman had died, one wondered who would become the guru of Formula One. At the start of the 80s, McLaren became the dominating force in Formula One. It had been founded in the 60s by the New Zealand Grand Prix driver Bruce McLaren, a former Cooper driver who had decided to go out on his own, but had been killed in testing in 1970. Co-directors had continued to run the team successfully, as demonstrated by the 2 championships won by Fittipaldi and Hunt in 1974 and 1976, but then success had dried up. The team was no longer a front runner when it was taken over by an ambitious team manager, Ron Dennis, who had the foresight to gather some talented and powerful people around him. There was the iron-handed designer John Barnard and the wealthy Mansour Ojeh with his company TAG, or Techniques d'Avant-Garde. Between them they supplied the ultimate weapon, the MP4 chassis, fitted with a 1.5-litre V6 turbo engine, developed, built and run exclusively for them by Porsche. But the most important innovation was the use of super light carbon fibre to build the monocoque rather than aluminium, as well as the car's Coca-Cola bottle shape, which would soon be copied by other teams. The Tag Porsche-engined McLaren MP4s first of all took the 1984, 1985 and 1986 championships with Lauda and Prost. Technically speaking, these cars had the most developed and most efficient chassis, as much in terms of stiffness as aerodynamically. The engine remained one of the best throughout 1984 and 85, and would remain one of the most reliable as well. The combination of the engine chassis and Dennis's reliability meant that this was one of the most successful periods of any team in Grand Prix racing. Dennis had raised the standard of team organisation to unprecedented levels. He had managed to raise a substantial budget, but in return for this, and also because of it, he used all his motivation and his purest ideals to go about the business of motor racing in a much more detailed way, tackling each and every job with greater care and professionalism. But by raising that standard, everyone else now had to seek greater budgets in order to attempt to rival his team, and the price of victory was so high that few could afford it. Dennis had to pay dearly for his Tag Porsche engines, but Hondas, while just as competitive, were a great deal cheaper.
We were in a customer-supplier relationship. We were the customer, they were the supplier. As in any customer-supplier relationship, we were paying, they were receiving our money, and they were making an engine to our specification. At the time, it was an immensely successful program, but it was becoming apparent that it was not possible to finance to the level that was going to be required. The 3.5 litre normally aspirated engine that was due to be introduced in '89. We chose to open discussions with Honda, and those discussions were based on the philosophy of our respective companies and the desire to have a real partnership. It was a sort of total commitment that you make, similar to a marriage. You know, it's for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, all these things, and that was a sort of level of commitment that we made.
And so continued the extraordinary run of success for the McLaren MP4. There was a brief interruption in 1987 when Williams Honda briefly took over, but in spite of the departure of Barnard, the original father of the MP4, the car's younger brothers and sisters remained competitive. From 1988 to 1991, the McLaren Hondas would win a further 4 consecutive titles, 3 for Senna, 1 for Prost. Unprecedented. Indeed, the sheer statistical success of the McLaren MP4 makes one reel. Between the McLaren Tag's first win at the 1984 Brazilian Grand Prix and the McLaren Honda's last win at the 1992 Australian Grand Prix, 9 seasons, these cars won 4 drivers' titles, 6 constructors' titles and 69 Grand Prix, an average of 7 wins per season for almost a decade. And that average rises to 9 per season if you take it from 1987 to 1992. Never had a team, and certainly not a car, spent so long at the peak of Formula One, a sport which, until Ron Dennis took over McLaren, had always seen constant swings and changes in power. Just as Chapman had been the master of technology and Ferrari has persevered for so many decades, so Ron Dennis, in terms of organisation, has left his mark on Formula One.
Grand Prix, a small world of fierce competition, of danger, and for the winner, of great rewards. Few people can succeed in this competition. One of the few who has is Colin Chapman. Motor racing is usually an expensive hobby for the rich amateur, or a showplace for the large manufacturer. Chapman is neither, yet his cars have twice won the Grand Prix World Championship. And here, at the German Grand Prix at Nürburgring, he's leading again, the season already 2/3 through. Chapman is a revolutionary in the strictly technical world of cars. He's a man who produces innovation after innovation for his thoroughbred machines. He's one of Britain's new generation of technocrats, super specialists in a narrow world. His favourite phrase is, fittingly, there are no mysteries. No one can make much money out of racing, but the name Chapman's racing cars bear is so illustrious that he's built a sports car business on it. The name is Lotus. Chapman opened his new Lotus factory in Norfolk 2 years ago. It cost more than £1 million. yet he started 15 years ago with only a £25 loan from his girlfriend, tinkering with a second-hand engine. How did he break through? His father was completely non-technical and kept a pub in North London. But after ordinary secondary school, Chapman was sent to London University, where he got a civil engineering degree, second class. He had a year in the Air Force, then joined a large aluminium firm. But privately, he was indulging his real passion, cars. He called his first car Lotus, a surprisingly poetic name for the machine, but drawn, he now tells us, from the name on a bathroom fitting.
Well, now what are we doing about this then? Have we definitely got lots of to buy these things? Oh, yeah.
At first, he prepared small second-hand cars for himself to race, but soon Lotus began to be known as a winner, and Chapman made his own name as a driver. Other people asked him to build cars for them, and since his racing was expensive, he began to sell cars from his garage cum factory. The breakthrough came 9 years ago with his first proper production car, the Lotus Elite. Now, only 15 years from the start, Chapman has made it, and from his brand new factory, he'll sell 3,000 cars this year, perhaps 5,000 in 2 years' time. Mr. Chapman, you've come an awful long way. How much are you now worth?
Oh, I really couldn't say. I haven't really stopped to work it out. We're busy developing Lotuses and Lotus companies and growing, and I'm more interested in the technical side of it. We did gross over £3 million worth of turnover last year, and I'm estimating around 4 million this year, I should think.
Well, it certainly makes you a millionaire anyway.
I don't know about that.
Did you have any great strokes of luck?
I think you have to have the right opportunities, most certainly. I don't know that luck really comes into it. I think it's more a question of seizing the opportunities that present themselves. And there's a lot of opportunities that come one's way that you realise afterwards that perhaps you didn't seize them quickly enough.
But to do a business like this, don't you have to be pretty ruthless?
I don't think you have to be ruthless. I think you have to be prepared to make some unpalatable decisions at times, because frequently you're faced with making a decision between two evils, and you're going to hurt somebody. And this is the tragedy of trying to run a business, that you do end up making unpalatable decisions sometimes, but there's no way out frequently.
Do you think anybody else could now set out and do what you've done?
I think there will always be a case for a relatively small, virile, adaptable business to fill in the gaps that must exist when you've got big business like the big car manufacturers fulfilling a mass market. There's always going to be scope for the man who can offer something better, something different, and this is what we intend to do.
Turning to racing, does racing really help you to develop your cars, or is it advertising and publicity?
We mainly go racing because I like it. I like going racing. I've always been involved in racing. I like the competitiveness of it. I like the comradeship of it. And I also like the technical fallout that comes from it. We do learn a tremendous amount from racing. Our engineers in the car company can take direct read-offs from our racing cars to our production cars in terms of suspension, handling, and safety. We stress everything to the limit on our race cars. We find out just what a part will do and how much it will stand, and then we then know what sort of safety limit we can incorporate in our production cars.
Making cars is usually a business for giant organizations. Making them in small numbers, cheaply enough to sell, is much more difficult. The cars have to be made largely from other firms' components. Indeed, Chapman uses parts from all over the industry, though he does now make his own bodies, from fiberglass, since metal would be far too expensive on this scale. But what counts, what justifies his brand name, is the design. It's here in design that Chapman's single-minded technical skill is outstanding. His most basic contribution is in suspension and chassis design. There's even a part known to the car world as the Chapman strut. The move to Norfolk was a typical Chapman gamble, breaking away from London to a disused aerodrome in an agricultural area. There was space, above all room for a private test track. Typical also was how he found the site. He drew a circle on the map, 100 miles radius from London. Then he got into a plane and flew himself round until he found what he wanted. Production cars now produce the big money, but racing cars proper are still a business for Chapman. He sells more than 100 a year. His own racing operation is Team Lotus, for which Graham Hill is now the top driver. Hill began his racing with Chapman, working as a Lotus mechanic in return for cars to drive.
What's Colin like? Is he a hard taskmaster to his drivers?
Yes and no. I mean, he doesn't actually drive you. He doesn't, I mean, which wouldn't work anyway, I don't think, and I think he appreciates that. But the sort of standard he sets for himself and his own mechanics more or less sets the tone. And of course, you've got to come up to that anyway. And consequently, by example, you get the standard set, which of course is a very high one.
What's his real contribution to motor racing?
Original thinking, and which is very unusual. I mean, actually, most things have been done before, and of course his design and his speed at getting things done, and of course his energy and drive and personality. You know, one can number quite a few things, but I think original thinking in motor racing, more or less setting the pace of design improvement and progress in motor racing.
A racing car is, simply, something to get an engine round a circuit as quickly as possible, while keeping its wheels stuck to the track. The specifications are strict, but Chapman's talent has been to develop his cars to the limit of what is allowed. With the monocoque body, he was the first to sit the driver, in effect, in the middle of the petrol tank, thus saving space and weight. Now he's developing the wedge-shaped aerodynamic body. With this jet-engined wedge, he took on the Americans at Indianapolis this year. He'd already won the American Classic in 1965, the first British constructor ever to do so.
I was horrified to see the way that the design of cars had stagnated over there, insofar as they just hadn't had the spur of competition that we'd had in Europe to evolve newer and better cars. And really I felt that all we needed to do was to take a European-style car to the state which we'd already evolved our racing car in Europe and take it to America, and it would be successful. Added to which, of course, the attitude in America was goaded us on a bit, insofar as that they felt that the only sort of racing was Indianapolis-type racing, and that all this Grand Prix racing was just fun for the boys. But when we won the race, they all started to copy this style immediately, and in fact all American race cars now are based on the European style of race car.
You go over to America a lot. Have you learned anything from American business methods?
I don't think that in particular the Americans have that much better ideas on business than can be found in the good firms in England. They do business on a larger scale, but a lot of their reputation is a bit of a myth, I feel.
What is this, public relations, or are they more public conscious? You're fairly public conscious.
I think they're very good at patting themselves on the back, whereas the British tend to criticise themselves all the time and more often. But if you compare the actual results achieved, I don't think there's all that much difference.
The Americans think that there's much less government interference than there is in Britain, for instance, with businessmen. Do you feel this? Do you feel that the load of the government machine is down on your neck the whole time?
I feel we could do with a far less government interference than we have in Britain at the moment. Not so much direct with businesses as with people. I feel that we're far too over-regulated. I feel that the unions are far too restrictive, that everyone takes a negative look instead of a positive look at the problem. And they still harp back too much on the bad old days. And I feel that these, in any enlightened society, these are gone forever, and what we should be doing now is looking to seizing opportunities, creating opportunities, and fostering progress, rather than trying to restrict everything down to a negative approach, which is what's happening now.
And yet you're something of a nationalist. You carry racing for Britain on your vans and on your cars, and you have made your own success here in Britain. How do you feel when you go abroad and come back? What do you feel about Britain?
The net result of spending 10 years travelling to most countries in the world racing makes me realise what a wonderful place Britain is and how pleased I am to come back to it.
There was another advantage in moving Lotus to a Norfolk aerodrome. Chapman has his own plane. This is one of the luxuries that wealth allows him, and one of the few hobbies away from cars that he allows himself. Another is the holiday home in Ibiza, to which he flies himself direct. This delight in flying is again typical. A technical challenge, a skill, and a means of saving time.
Oscar, I'd now like to take off. Can you clear the track, please?
Roger, will do.
Colin, this aeroplane, is it really just a rich man's toy, or is it essential to you?
Oh, I think it's absolutely essential for the amount of travelling that I find necessary in connection with the business and racing. Being placed 100 miles from London as we are, it's handy to be able to get into London in a total of about an hour, which involves about half an hour's flying time. And of course it's easy to get to the continent. I can be in Amsterdam within 3/4 of an hour of leaving my office. And this is really necessary in order to cope with the amount of business that we do nowadays. Hey, there's our transporter leaving, look. See our red and white transporter?
He flew to Rouen for the French Grand Prix in July, the 6th of this year's 12 championship races. As always, Chapman was experimenting, this time with the revolutionary aerofoil.
Want it back on? Yes, I should think so. Yeah, if you can get it on time.
Otherwise?
Well, I don't know whether we're going to.
Well,
Yes, we might. We've got 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Well, have a go. See if you can get it back on in time. Well, you're about half a second slower than Rin and Stewart at the moment. Why don't you just do one run? Just do one run and see what it's like.
Winning motor races is a matter of gaining mere seconds, and it's here that the new ideas count. A novel technique like the aerofoil, if successful, is quickly taken up by all competitors. But at the moment, it's still an experiment, which may produce its own problems. The aerofoil is designed to force the car down on the road to help it corner. But Chapman and Hill had had a run of transmission failures. Were these the result of new strains imposed by the inverted wing?
It'll run like this.
It'll run like it, except the engine seems to kind of stop when I change gear down the head.
Yeah. Well, maybe we could set the slow running up a bit to stop there.
Yeah, it would run.
Can we set the slow running up a sniff? How difficult is that? All right, no, we'll do that in the paddock. Right, if you can get out again now. Is it all back on? Right, it's all back on again.
Oh, wait a minute.
Isn't it quick? Well, they've got a magic device now, you see. You're going to get time for about 2 laps.
There's perpetual danger in all this speed and experiment. Everything is stressed to the limit, is run to the edge of safety. Hill's troubles were nothing to those of the other Lotus driver at Rouen. Jackie Oliver had a monumental crash in practice, and his car was completely torn to pieces. He had a miraculous escape.
Can you bring Graham in? Give him the in signal.
He came in and he's gone out again.
No, well, let's have him in again. Oh, dearie me. Cool, you were white. You're better now. You were pretty white 10 minutes ago. I think you ought to sit down. Sit down in the chair. Really?
I saw that one coming up.
You want a drink?
Sure, that's right. Well, what else could it be? You didn't hit anything, did you? You haven't actually hit anything all the time when it's spun. No, it didn't hit anything.
All I've done was spun at the hairpin. All that slow lap.
You see, the whole of the rear suspension is in fact hung on that gearbox. And if that breaks, well, that's it. But then they're all on the same basis. Hey, Bruce, look, I think I better tell you, the gearbox bell housing broke, and you know the whole of our rear suspension's hung on the gearbox, same as yours. And it's just broken in half in the middle. You know, the bell housing's got a hell of a load in it, if you think about it. That's all that's happened, it's just broken in half. I'm bringing Graham in, I'm not going to run him like that. You better have a look and see if there's any cracks in your bell housing.
Do you think we ought to have Graham in?
Chapman's first theory about the accident in the heat of the moment was wrong. It was nothing to do with the gearbox. But now he, the designer, had £18,000 worth of junk metal to examine.
Any idea at all, Mr. Chapman, what might have caused it? I haven't a clue at the moment. It's very early days to say. We'll have to have a look and see if anything, you know, if we can see anything obvious. It looks as if the body held together very well, the monocoque.
Monocoque saved me.
Yeah. See, all these things are just straightforward tension. See that one? This thing is just pulled straight off, taking the head with it, look. What was happening? Were you going straight when it happened?
Yes, in a straight line. You can see where the skid marks are up there.
And then what did you know? You were going backwards, suddenly?
Well, it moved funnily across the road towards the right. And then it just spun, started to go backwards, but it didn't spin completely, it only went halfway, and then started to go backwards, and then it went the whole turn again, and next thing I saw was the wall here.
You hit the wall, was that what stopped you?
Well, it stopped me, yeah, quite enough, but I bounced off and ended up this way and then jumped out.
Oliver was all right, but the agony for a designer like Chapman is that things do go wrong. This spring, Mike Spence was killed in a Lotus, and the master driver, Jim Clark.
I did get very, very close to Jim Clark. He was, I would say, my best friend I've ever had. We got on terribly well together. I understood exactly what he wanted and so on, and I think he understood exactly what I meant when we conversed on the subject. Plus, we were very good friends off the track. Jimmy was, in my opinion, probably the greatest racing driver there's ever been. He's been a very rare combination of a fantastically high intellect, a fantastically high ability, with a tremendous concentration. And I don't think there are any other drivers that, in my experience of Grand Prix racing over the last 10 years, have ever equalled or ever likely to equal the sort of a total race driver concept that Jimmy was. And this is the tragedy of motor racing, is when you do get close to a driver and there is an accident, of course, it hurts you so much more.
A racing driver's life is in the hands of the designer, but also in those of the mechanics. They are the third strand in this tiny, close-knit world.
What's Chapman like to work for?
Exacting, reasonable in the main, I think. It's very difficult to be completely reasonable with the amount of work you've got to cover. Sometimes people are working very late hours and there's lots of work to do, but it must be done if you expect to win.
Is he easier to get on with when you're winning? What happens when you start having a losing streak?
I think he's easier to get on with when we're losing, actually. Seems, you know, to try and
to ease you on and help you along. It's quite reasonable.
Has he got a temper?
Yes. Yes, he's got a definite temper. He doesn't lose it very often, though. It has to be something fairly stupid or severe to get him really going.
On the day of a Grand Prix, the private technical life of men like Chapman is invaded temporarily by the enthusiasts, by glamour. The atmosphere is international, sometimes zany. Honda's team had their Japanese lunch flown from Paris. Though he's now a manufacturing tycoon, Chapman is still hooked on this small, competitive racing fraternity. Other manufacturers like Mercedes and even for a time Ferrari have pulled out of it. Racing doesn't pay by itself, good advertising as victory can be. But Chapman goes on, win or lose.
There's tremendous excitement and tension and atmosphere in racing. I must admit it's a terribly disappointing sport to take part in because there's 18 or 20 cars go out for the race, only one of them can ever win. But after a while you begin to realise that this is the pattern of it and that you all have your share of good times and you have your share of your bad times, and they're roughly in the ratio of 18 to 1.
Colin, how do you fancy the chances? It's starting to rain.
Yes, well, it's one of these problem days where we're not quite sure whether it's going to rain or not. I don't think it'll come on heavy rain, and in light rain, I think the tyres we're using are as good as any that we've got. Although I must admit that I feel a lot happier if we had a tyre that worked better in the wet.
How do you feel personally at this moment? Are you highly nervous?
I always get a little nervous, yes. I always hope it's all going to stay together. You know, there's so many things that can go wrong with a racing car that the unusual one really is the one that finishes rather than the one that doesn't. There is tremendous tension at the start of the race because this is what we've all been working for. This is what all the mechanics have slaved away many, many hours in the garages, and what we've all worked on the drawing boards and so on to get this car to the starting line. And this is going to be the moment when we find out whether all the things we think are going to work are in fact going to work. The drivers, of course, are quite tense because they realise that in a few moments they're going to be involved in a very high-speed procession down through that first corner, where every man has to be very, very careful to make sure that he doesn't touch another car and precipitate a multiple accident and so on. I'm sure Graham will do his best. Keep it going. It's the main thing.
Chapman won no prizes at Rouen. In fact, the race was something of a disaster, and Hill broke down again. But even at home, Chapman doesn't get away from cars. The technical man par excellence, he hasn't really got many interests outside the technical. He keeps fit, is weight conscious, but he's always designing something. Nor does he take time to indulge in his new wealth. Predictably, he's got a lot of cars, 7 of them, but otherwise he doesn't spend with a millionaire's abandon. His one big new venture is the £40,000 house he's building. In a way, it's like Chapman himself. Modern inside, but outside conservative. Chapman prefers, he says, something enduring.
Come on, Clive, now do somersault, Clive. You can do it. Come on, off, let me have a go. Come on, take along. Woo! Please, ready? Got it, Claire? Yes, you do. Yeah, I am a bit hungry. 1, 2, 3, change. In. No, come on.
Until the new house is finished, the Chapman family lives simply, if comfortably. No servants, just an au pair girl. Mrs. Chapman is used to making her own curtains and does the cooking. It was she who lent him that £25 that got him started on his way to become a millionaire. How does she think the success has changed her husband?
Well, to me, I think he's a better person for it. He's a lot more tolerant now and understanding of people, and he's more interested in other people. And I think it's, whether it's just he's getting older and people improve that way, I don't know. But I think he's better for it, actually.
Now, has it changed your life? You suddenly got building a great big house, and a new house. Do you find that having come to a great deal of money, does this change your life a lot?
No, I don't think we've changed at all, really. I think we've always had to work hard for what we've got, and I think that, in a way, has made us appreciate things a great deal more now. And I think, really, we enjoy quite simple things.
Would you like him to let off the pressure and to relax, and you just to relax into a quieter life?
Well, I wouldn't like him to relax too much, because I think it's better for a husband and wife to have times together and times apart. I find that's worked very well. And I don't really ever think Colin would ever retire or relax completely. He's got to have something to occupy him. He's that sort of a person.
Now you've become a millionaire. What difference has it made to your life? You laugh every time I say you're a millionaire, but you
well,
are.
no one's ever said it before, so I haven't really got used to the idea, even if it is true.
It's still a shock to you to think of yourself as a millionaire?
I think so, yes. No one's ever said that they thought I was a millionaire, and I don't really know that I am, actually. I would say I have a very good company, but I don't, no one's valued it yet, so I don't really know just what it's worth. I forgot what your question was now.
When you look coming up to the present and you were amused at the thought you were now a millionaire, it's been a very rapid change. What difference has that made to your life?
Well, it hasn't made any difference, really, as I've said, because it hasn't really sunk in yet. All I really notice is that with the work I do, working during the week at the business and weekends racing, leaves me very little spare time. And this is the one facet of my current existence which rather disappoints me. I would like to spend more time at home and more time with my children.
Have you ever had much time now? I wouldn't have thought you were a man who rested much.
Oh no, I don't rest much even when I'm at home. I'm always doing something and chasing around or drawing or designing or doing something, but at least I'm at home, whereas I spend so much time away. This is rather disappointing.
But you've now become a super tycoon or a tycoon. How do you look on the older established tycoons who you find around in English society? Do you think English society needs to be jazzed up a good deal?
I think there should be more opportunities for people to show their true worth, and I don't think that it should just be going on their education or their social background. I think there is a tremendous amount of good in most people, and you can't classify people as to whether they're going to be successful or whether they're not. I do think that a university education is a great benefit to future life, not so much as what you learn as just the training for thinking and the training for reasoning and questioning everything that's gone before. The man I don't like is the expert who has pedantic views on what can be done and what can't be done, because in 9 cases out of 10 they're wrong.
Do you see yourself relaxing more now you've made it?
As I say, I haven't adjusted myself to this fact that I've made it, but I don't see there's any point in relaxing at the moment. We have a tremendous challenge ahead of us. We've got a lot of new ideas coming through the development shops at the moment, new cars, and I can't see any scope for relaxation for the next 4 or 5 years at least.
Well, there is one change. There's your new house, which is going to be a magnificent place. This is a rather different way of living to what you lived before, isn't it?
It's an objective. I always have to have an objective, and preferably some sort of hobby or something other than motoring and motor cars, because you can get terribly stale if you do nothing but motor cars. And flying has always been very interesting to me. I like flying. I fly my own aeroplane to most of the races and so on. I must say I've got a lot of fun out of designing and developing this house and the grounds that go with it, and I think it's a jolly good hobby, and I shall enjoy that for a few more years yet.
You seem to be constantly giving yourself problems to solve. Are you a competitive man?
How do you mean a competitive man? I always like to succeed at anything I try to do, and I always feel that, yes, I suppose I am. I always like to try to do anything better than I see it being done before.
Colin Chapman, the competitive man, has made his million out of cars. But his wealth hasn't changed him much. He's conservative, patriotic. His pleasures are still as they've always been, in the tackling of technical problems. He's partly a standard British type, but he's also a trailblazer in this modern, machine-dominated world. For such a man, motor racing, which is invention fired by competition, makes the perfect arena. For Chapman, it's more than the springboard to a fortune, more than a mere testbed for new ideas. To Colin Chapman, millionaire, Grand Prix is both a challenge and a fulfillment.
I think if you try hard enough at racing, you should always be able to win your share of races. I don't think that it is beneficial for anybody if any one team won all the races. We want to win a third of them if we can, and if we don't, it's only because we don't try hard enough.